Hello, welcome back. I just want to first remind you all that we have an evaluation form that we'd like everybody to fill out and hand in by the end of the day. I will now we'll just start with the afternoon portion of the program, which is going to be, I think, really stimulating and compelling as well as the morning one was. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hannah Brown, who is our Director of Research of the MGH First Episode in Early Psychosis Program. And Dr. Brown really exemplifies, somebody who, the type of, faculty member we don't have that much of anymore, really like a triple threat, at least, in the sense that she is an outstanding, highly skilled clinician doing really cutting edge research in, molecular and in, digital advanced technologies, which she's going to be telling you about shortly. And she's also a fantastic and well-loved teacher of, clinical trainees and medical students. So she's going to be talking about information technology and schizophrenia, and this is really a growing area in the field. I think Dr. Rothman referred to the fact that we really have very poor methods for finding out what people are doing, what people with schizophrenia are doing, what their symptoms are like when they're not in our office, and this has really impeded the progress of the field in terms of both research and in clinical care. And so now there are these new methods that are just emerging that is going to allow us to have much better sort of objective information about this. So Dr. Brown's going to tell us a little bit about this kind of developing field.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be speaking with you all today.
Can you use the mic?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
No, I can't.
Okay. I was just saying it's such an honor to be speaking with you all today. This is my disclosure slide. So today we'll talk about some potential uses of technology. We'll talk about the accessibility of technology, the acceptability. I'll give you some examples of how we use technology and also talk about some of the limitations. So there are many forms of information and communication technologies. Today I'll focus on mobile technology, in specifically app-based, social media, internet or web-based, and digital technologies. And I'll provide examples from each category to help highlight some of their potential uses. There's a lot, and I'm just learning about a lot of them, so I'm going to try not to overwhelm you, but I do want to give you examples from each category so you can see some of their potential uses. The use of these technologies is still being studied, and they're not yet part of they're not yet integrated into our clinical care models. Most of what we've learned are from smaller feasibility studies, and there haven't been many large-scale studies for treatment of schizophrenia yet. So let's first think about the limitations of our current clinical care model, exactly what Daphne was just referring to. So, and then we can think about how we can potentially use these technologies to help intervene and fix some of these limitations. So as you know, our clinical visits can be infrequent. Sometimes we don't see people for weeks to months, and our clinical visits are really limited in scope. Often it's hard for people to remember their symptoms in between visits, what happened in between visits. Our visits are kind of like snapshots of a person's life. So we could potentially use technology to improve on some of these limitations. And how could we do that? I'll go through many more specific examples, but some ideas. Monitoring symptoms, activity, medication adherence, treatment, both acute interventions, immediate support, relapse prevention, which I'll talk about, and then logistical things like appointment reminders. So we want to use technology, but what about the accessibility of technology? So this data comes from a web-based study of over 450 individuals with schizophrenia. They found that technology access is common. Many individuals have access to 2 or 3 devices. The most common activities are surfing the internet, visiting social networking sites, playing web-based games, sending text messages. And the rates of access to technology among individuals with schizophrenia is similar to that of the general population. Now, people who have had a longer illness duration actually have less access to electronic devices, internet, social media, and this is thought to be more age-related. Now, what about the acceptability? So if we go back to individuals early in the course of illness, most individuals, this comes from a small survey, most individuals agreed or strongly agreed with using social media sites to receive mental health information. They're agreeable to use technology for a variety of different things, reminders for medication, receiving information, making informed decisions. And most individuals early in the course of illness own internet-capable devices. In terms of feelings towards web-based technologies, again, most individuals with psychosis note positive experiences related to using the internet. Although some felt frustrated or anxious in relation to it, some reported unpleasant experiences, and a small percentage stopped taking their medications because of something they learned on the internet. So it's acceptable, but we have to remember it's not all positive. So in general, I'd say technology is accessible and acceptable. So let's look at some examples, and I'll start with the mobile phone or smart. I'll be talking mostly about the smartphone, actually. So among individuals with psychosis, mobile phone ownership is high. If we look at a systematic review of mobile phone app studies in schizophrenia, there were actually there's no evidence of any adverse events related to technology. It's feasible to collect information from mobile phones and also to offer clinical guidance. And like I mentioned, today I'll focus on just giving you some examples of smartphone apps or applications, which are basically computer programs that run on a mobile device. So I'll start with an app that focuses on monitoring relapse. And why is that important? So early warning signs of relapse can be difficult to detect. And I'll repeat what I said earlier. Our interval clinical appointments don't allow for continuous monitoring of symptoms. We do rely on people to accurately describe and remember their symptoms, and that can be hard to do. So in our visits, we're not necessarily collecting accurate longitudinal information about somebody's real-world day-to-day experience. So this app is called, this is the first example I'll show you. It's called the crosscheck app, and it collects data both through active self-report assessments on the smartphone and then passive behavioral information, and I'll give you some specific details. This information is then uploaded to a secure server, and the information is remotely monitored by clinicians. The assessments include 10-item self-reports that are collected 3 days per week on the individual's smartphone. The questions range in nature from questions about psychotic symptoms to general health and function. And a lower score indicates a higher risk of relapse, so more severe symptoms. Then, if the risk score exceeds a certain threshold, this will trigger a check-in from the clinical team. The behavioral information that's continuously collected includes information about an individual's physical activity, their GPS location data, speech frequency and duration, how often they use the phone, how often they use their apps, and how frequently the phone is unlocked. So here are two examples so this is still being studied, but there's some preliminary data that's been published. These are two examples of different relapse patterns prior to hospitalization. So let me tell you I'll show you these examples of two different relapse patterns. So this is, as you remember, on the y-axis here, the assessment score, and a lower score denotes more severe symptoms. This blue line is hospitalization, so relapse and hospitalization, and on the x-axis is the time in days. So you can see in this individual, their assessment scores decrease, the symptoms get more severe around the time of relapse. This is not the case in this individual. Their assessment score actually stays pretty constant right up until the time of relapse and hospitalization. So they're saying they're feeling well. But what does change is their geospatial data. So when before relapse, they spend many hours in one place, sort of their home environment. But close to relapse and hospitalization, they're not spending any time there. And actually, this individual had some delusional beliefs about their home environment and would not stay at the home. So two different types of relapse patterns, important for clinicians to remember. So this app, they looked at individuals using with schizophrenia using this app over a year. They found it acceptable, feasible, as I mentioned, different patterns of relapse, and the individuals did re-engage with the app after discharge from the hospitalization. I'm going to give you an example of a second phone app which targets negative symptoms. As you know, negative symptoms can be extremely impairing, contribute to difficulty functioning on a day-to-day basis. And there's an impairment, there can be a significant impairment in motivation. This mobile app is called the Personalized Real-Time Intervention for Motivational Enhancement, or PRIME. And it focuses on three different components targeting motivational deficits. So I showed you just the screenshot here. One is individual goal setting. So this is shoot hoops for 30 minutes. I did it, I'm going to do it later. Then there's text messages, motivational coaching from therapists in real time. And then there's a social networking component. So peers can message each other. And so there's sort of this online social peer community. So the investigators looked at a very sort of feasibility study with only a few participants early in the course of illness. They all found this app acceptable and feasible, and they were engaged in the platform. They used it on average every other day. And I'm including here some comments from some of the users. Now, finally, I'll talk about a therapy-based app specifically for CBT called, I hope I'm saying this right, Actisist. It's targeted to help in the recovery of psychosis and used for illness self-management, shared decision-making about treatment, and it's designed to help provide helpful coping strategies in real time. It targets 5 domains associated with psychosis, so auditory hallucinations, paranoia, perceived criticism, socialization, cannabis use. And the user can engage spontaneously with it, so they can trigger the use on their phone, or in response to a prompt, which happens a few times during the course of the day. Here's just an example of what the app use looks like, again, either self-initiating or via a notification. The user selects a target area of interest that they want help in, so voices, suspicious thought, and then they use CBT-based principles to help cope with the distressing experiences. This group did a proof of concept pilot randomized controlled trial of 36 individuals, again, early in the course of illness. They randomized the individuals to receive either the CBT-based app plus treatment as usual, or another symptom monitoring app, which didn't have the CBT support plus treatment as usual. They found the app was feasible, acceptable, safe. Users noted high levels of satisfaction with the app. And this app, the CBT-based app, did provide an added treatment benefit for improvement of psychotic symptoms over the active control, the ClinTouch app, plus treatment as usual. Before we move on, I want to tell you about a smartphone app that we're piloting here called BWE. This app was designed in partnership with the Center for Quantitative Health here at MGH and the Harvard School of Public Health. It combines longitudinal active and passive data streams like the crosscheck app I told you about. And so the active component are self-reports, both daily brief questions about symptoms and well-being, and then also weekly questions, more in-depth questions. Here are just examples of some of our questions that users see on a day-to-day basis. So, how interested were you in talking, texting, or emailing with other people today? How active were you today? How good was your mood today? How well did you sleep last night? And then there's a range of responses for the user. And then, similar to crosscheck app, there's some of the behavioral data that we're collecting. So the GPS location, the phone's movement, tracking of how often the apps are used, anonymized phone and text message logs. So not the content of the phone call or the text messages, but how frequently people are texting. And then there's a component where the user can do free-form voice sampling, so record anything that they want into the microphone. And then all the information gets uploaded to a secure server. And the idea is that the clinician can then monitor social functioning, behavioral patterns, track symptoms, and ideally improve clinical care. So those are some mobile phone app, smartphone app examples. Let's move to some internet-based examples. So first, when we're thinking about the web, most internet users at some point, so this is in general, search for health-related content. So, and we know that information that people find online affects their healthcare decisions and their help-seeking behaviors. The web is also a primary source for information when psychotic symptoms are developing. So one approach to targeting individuals with psychosis is to use web-based digital marketing, and in particular, Google Ads. So I'm sure you've all seen Google Ads. The ads appear in response to an online search result that match certain keywords. And so this provides an opportunity for an immediate intervention, which I'll talk about, but you can see here an example. You type in the word hair salon, and what pops up is an ad targeting that keyword that the user typed in. So as I mentioned, individuals and families use the web to gain information, especially when psychotic symptoms are emerging. So this digital marketing is a potential way to target these individuals. So this group did a campaign for 3 months in New York City. They wanted to identify and engage youth with early stage psychosis in treatment. So using the Google Ads platform, they selected more than 2,000 words and phrases, and they organized them over 15 thematic ad groups. So, for example, you can see some of the themes, so auditory hallucinations, mental illness, psychosis test, psychosis treatment help, schizophrenia signs and symptoms. And so then, once the user typed these in, unique ads would appear in response to searches that matched the keyword. And then the ads would encourage a desired action. So, for example, find support or take a psychosis self-screener. So what happened? So over 4,000 individuals clicked on the ads. 44% obtained psychosis-specific information, 15% completed the psychosis self-screener, but only 1% contacted their local early treatment program, either via phone or email. The most clicked on ads were "You're not alone, we can help," "Hard to tell what is real," and "Getting help early matters." And the top call to action line, so meaning the top line that invited an actual an action, was take an online quiz, find support, or learn the signs, find support. So let me now switch to give you an example of digital technology. And again, this is something that I'm just learning about. I'm going to use the example of avatar therapy for auditory hallucinations. So first let's talk about the auditory hallucinations. So auditory hallucinations of voices are often experienced as coming from entities or beings that have certain identities. So the hearer of the voices has a personal relationship with that entity. Sometimes the voices can be experienced as dominant, omnipotent, powerful. So in avatar therapy, individuals create a computerized digital representation, an avatar, of the entity that's producing the auditory hallucinations. They design the avatar so the speech of the avatar matches the speech patterns of their persecutory voice. And then the individual can have a face-to-face dialogue with that digital representation of that being. And the voices are voiced by their therapist. Then the therapist helps create a dialogue between the individual and their avatar. And over time, the avatar will respond, becoming less hostile and helping the voices to be less bothersome. Let me show you an example of this. So this example is out of King's College in London, as you'll see. Can you hear it? This is the avatar.
You're rubbish. You're rubbish. You're
This
a
is-
waste of space.
This is the therapist.
Can you go away, please?
This is the patient.
That's good, Lauren. That's good. But can you try and make it a bit stronger for me? Sit up, look at him. Tell him to go away, okay?
Avatar therapy is for people who hear distressing auditory hallucinations or voices. So these are mainly people who have diagnoses of schizophrenia and related conditions. A computer system is used to create a face representing the entity that the person usually believes is behind their voices, and a copy of the voice they hear. And the software is remarkable in that it can produce a complete range of voices, voice transforms, so that we get a very high match of what the person experiences to what they see on the computer.
Whenever his friends asked him if he would like to go out with them, he would only answer, I don't know. He wouldn't say yes, and he wouldn't say no either.
So the therapy is delivered over 6 sessions, each of about 10 minutes long, where the person's having a dialogue with their avatar. And gradually the avatar changes in response to the person standing up to it. So as the person says, I'm tired of hearing this, leave me alone, the avatar gradually concedes the whole experience changes from something that's very frightening to something that's much more in the person's control. Tell him you don't want to hear this rubbish anymore when he comes in with his usual statements.
How come you're so confident?
Because I'm not going to listen to you anymore.
So
Okay, so this group in the UK did a randomized controlled trial comparing that avatar therapy with supportive counseling with a supportive counseling intervention for 150 individuals with schizophrenia or affective psychosis and distressing auditory hallucinations. As he mentioned, they had 6 weekly 50-minute sessions, including 10 to 15 minutes with the avatar therapist. Users found this feasible, acceptable, they didn't note any adverse events, and there was a rapid and sustained reduction in the severity of auditory hallucinations after 12 weeks in the avatar group. So perhaps for those individuals with persistent auditory hallucinations and taking medication that doesn't fully treat the hallucinations, this is an option. So finally, I'll give you an example of how social media can potentially be used in treatment. Social media is a powerful resource. There are at least 2 billion users worldwide. And Twitter, which I'll give you use an example, has over 300 million monthly users globally. Young people early in the course of illness use social networking sites. They're active on social media. They discuss symptoms, ask about treatment. The screenshot I've included here is Big White Wall, which is a mental health community based in the UK, which provides peer support through this online social community. It offers information, advice, and also live therapy. So anyway, this group wanted to use social media to identify individuals with psychosis and help engage in treatment. Taking a step back, previous work had shown that there are certain language markers that are associated with schizophrenia. In terms of word frequency, word categories, use of self-referential pronouns. And there are, for example, there are differences in online posts written by individuals with schizophrenia compared to individuals with other illnesses, compared to healthy controls. So what this group did was they examined Twitter feeds of those individuals who self-disclosed as having schizophrenia. And then they took what they call a human-machine approach. So the Twitter users were checked for authenticity by clinicians, so there was some clinician involvement. And then they used machine learning to try to distinguish users with schizophrenia from those for healthy controls based on language patterns. And what they found were those who had self-described as having schizophrenia had an increased use of first-person pronouns, greater emphasis on biological processes like body or health, and they were less likely to use words from the friends category. So there was a decreased emphasis on friendship. So again, this social media and this Twitter platform may be a way to identify and engage individuals with psychosis. In the last minute or two, I just want to talk about some limitations. We talked a lot about acceptability, feasibility, all the benefits of a wide range of technologies, but of course the limitations are important as well. Obvious limitation, not everyone has access to technology. There's a cost associated with buying devices with access to Wi-Fi. When we're going to collect data, the individuals have to be carrying their phones or their device to actually collect the information. People may share their devices with other people, so if we're collecting data, we have to make sure that it's coming from the actual person we're working with. And right now there's a variation between phones and devices, so we have to make sure whatever platform we're using is accessible across devices. We'll need a lot of technical support and also to make sure data is safe and secure. As I mentioned, all these studies are, the technology studies are pretty early on in development, and this allows for still some fragmentation of care. The information that we're collecting is not yet integrated into the medical health record. As I mentioned, collecting longitudinal data in between clinical visits is not the same either as coming in and seeing the person face to face. We have to make sure that using technology doesn't exacerbate symptoms for some people, and also be aware of things like cyberbullying, bullying on social media. And then, as I mentioned, most studies that are out there report on feasibility, not large-scale delivery and implementation. Technology is evolving so quickly, and the publications of studies are really behind the growth of technology. Most studies are also pretty short in duration. But I think the research is there. It shows the acceptability and feasibility of using a wide range of technologies and collecting data, and ultimately implementing interventions and improving our care. I think going forward, we have to work on the accessibility and how do we respectfully implement technology into people's lives. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Good questions here. Some practical, some more philosophical almost. Start with some fairly straightforward ones, I think. So these apps seem guaranteed to make a paranoid schizophrenic much more paranoid. Do you see this?
Yeah, so I think initially that was the concern. So something is monitoring you, something is always collecting data from you on a constant basis. That was one of the concerns. But that's actually not what the large surveys, some of which I showed, that's actually not what it's, some of the research is showing, that people, it is actually acceptable for people, even who have paranoid symptoms. That being said, you're absolutely right. You have to be careful. That's not the rule for everybody. So it may exacerbate symptoms for some people. So that is something we do have to be careful with. We do We do have to be aware of. Totally agree.
So you would say there were quite a few questions around this, just to be clear. So you think it's actually reasonable to ask people who are paranoid to fill something out and they will do it, like an app? Or is it perhaps even easier for them to do it because it seems anonymous enough as opposed to actually talking to a person, which is something I've read. I'm not sure if that's true.
Yeah, and like I said, I think the surveys and the early data is showing that it is feasible to do that, and also a lot of what is collected is passive. So yes, people are filling out questionnaires, but a lot of it is passive. It's their behaviors, their use of the phone, their location. So it's not necessarily intrusive, and often people may not even remember that they're being monitored.
We are being monitored as we speak, just in a surveillance state. How do you? We tend to forget, I guess. How do you convince? So another obstacle here that somebody wondered about. How do you convince a person who is hearing voices to do the work on any app? People might have difficulties remembering, and so in the real world, are they actually able to do this reliably? Or is there maybe two groups? The group that can do it, and then there's a group it's just simply not going to work.
Yeah, I think especially perhaps, I'm generalizing here, but perhaps in the younger people who are sort of, technology is a way of life. as I showed, younger people in particular with psychotic illness use technology in the same patterns as the general population. So I think as technology becomes just a regular way of life, it may not seem that abnormal to be using it as part of clinical care. And then logistically, people receive reminders multiple times. In some of these apps, people receive reminders multiple times per day, prompting them to answer questions about whatever, mood, symptoms, etc.
So we often, when we think about adherence, we think of adherence to medicines. How is the adherence to these apps? Is it a similar problem?
Yeah. So there have been a couple studies looking actually at adherence to mobile apps, and a large systematic review of adherence to mobile apps. The adherence rate is actually pretty high. It's on average around, so among mobile app studies, the adherence rate is about 80%. So people do tend to adhere to their app-based treatment.
Are these apps expensive? Can you download them for free? Would insurance pay for it?
That's a great question. So everything I showed you is still in the research phase. So we're not yet using them in clinical care. So most of everything I showed you comes from research studies. So participants either are volunteering to take part or being paid to take part in these studies. So we're not quite at that point. I mean, ideally, we'd use them in clinical care, on a day-to-day basis, and the user wouldn't have to pay for them, or they'd be covered by insurance. That's sort of in an ideal world, but we're not there yet.
So related, quite a few people asked the obvious question, is avatar therapy available at MGH anywhere?
So I don't know. What I showed you was this research group out of the UK and King's College. So we're not yet doing it at MGH. Maybe that's a hope for the future.
Well, looking at the future, how jobs might change, do you think that clinicians will, and I'm not sure if this question is asking something that's positive or negative, are clinicians begin to see the app as an alternative to individual therapy? So I guess the question is there concern that people are just going to do app-based stuff and no longer actually see real people? Mm-hmm. Or is it maybe, for some people, even better in some ways? Because it tends to be, there are some studies that show we have no problems filling out very private stuff if it comes in electronic form, something we would not do with humans.
So I think these will go hand in hand. So I don't think one would replace the other, but they're sort of complementary. I think I don't think you can take the place of an in-person visit, seeing somebody, talking to somebody, getting a sense of who they are. I don't think that will ever go away, but I think they can complement each other. So it can provide more in the data collection can provide more information for the clinician, for the patient, to help in treatment, to help in therapy, to find target areas to work on, to discuss. But I don't think one would replace the other.
So quite a few people seem to be sorry about us physicians, because they asked how is it going to change for physicians, specifically how are we going to manage this flood of data? Are we going to fundamentally change what we do as physicians?
So that's a great question. That's not something I talked about, but that's something that's been thought about a lot, is how are we going to manage all of this data? How are we going to have the technical support to do this? How are we going to go through all of this information? So that is going to require, I think, a lot more support for the clinicians from the and technical support, and how to prioritize, how to make sense of it all, and then how to integrate it into clinical care. Yeah, I think I mentioned that one of the limitations, having technical support, I think will be very important if we're going to implement some of these technologies. And for example, in our BWE app, it's not monitored in real time, and we tell patients that up front. So if you have anything that you're, the voice sampling, if you say something that's concerning that you want to let your clinician know immediately, you still have to call us because we're not looking at the data in real time. We're looking at certain time points longitudinally. So right now we don't have the bandwidth to do that on a continuous basis.
Last point, it's a big point. I think it has to do with that, Google is a private entity, right? But don't they have a very large ethical responsibility here? For example, with these Google ads, who's going to determine just the dollar amount that they can make, which site gets prioritized? Are there actually nonprofits who are trying to, influence these algorithms that determine that people actually end up, getting pushed towards, for better or worse, to better sites, as opposed to things that in the end is just crap, Excuse me. Yeah. You know what I mean. And I think, is the mental health community, as far as are we involved in this, or is there a little bit of a problem, also a generational divide that, I don't even have a Facebook account, just a little secret here, don't look me up there. And I'm proud of it. And yet I do see that this is the future. So, I'm a little worried sometimes that the Department of Mental Health, for example, the state is a little bit behind because it's run by people on the older side, perhaps. And how are we going to, figure this out going forward?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I don't know. I couldn't give you a definitive answer, but one thing I will point out is, so the Google ads that I showed you, the keywords that I showed you, the list of keywords that were selected to prompt the ads. Some of those keywords were competing keywords for pharmaceutical companies. So you're right, it depends on how much they pay. So if they pay a higher amount, the pharmaceutical company ads bumps in there before the ads for the intervention. So you're right, that's a huge problem if you're going to use those marketing strategies. And perhaps something that, I don't know, does Google take responsibility? Do they have an ethical responsibility to take? I'm not sure, but I think if we're going to use that marketing platform, something to seriously think about. It's a very good point.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Anna.